Live. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
On behalf of the India-Oxford Initiative at the University of Oxford, I would like to begin by saying that our hearts go out to India at this distressing time. As it happens, it is also an important time to discuss sociopolitical concerns in India, regardless of which side of the political discourse you prefer. Meetings like this are reminders of some of the reasons to gather and discuss not just the latest scholarship, but also the broader associations and significance of this work. Today, we are gathered to hear one of India's preeminent public intellectuals whose work on Indian history has been fundamental for understanding India, not only of the past, but certainly of the present, as she has been an important voice at a time when there is an erosion of democratic freedoms across the world. She has fought fearlessly for freedom of expression and against those who undermine the very fabric and autonomy of academic institutions. As one of the most distinguished scholars of our time, who has balanced the popular and the intellectual with ease, I feel deeply honored to be here in this company. It is my absolute pleasure and privilege to welcome Romila Thapar, Professor Emeritus at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, the author of a very long list of publications, including her most recent book, Voices of Dissent. She has also received numerous honors and awards, including the John Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity. Also with us today is my eminent colleague, Faisal Devji, Professor of Indian History and Fellow at St. Anthony's College, Oxford. He is the author of 4 books, including one on Gandhi's thought and another on Pakistan as a political idea. It is an honor to introduce our speakers and handing over to both of them for subsequent discussion. My name is Mallica Kumbera Landrus, and I am the head of the Eastern Art Department, fellow of St. Cross College, associate professor and senior curator of Indian art at the Ashmolean Museum in the University of Oxford. I'm also the chair of the India-Oxford Initiative, which was created 2 years ago in response to demand across the University of Oxford for greater collaboration on India. The initiative is a mechanism to build, develop, and sustain equitable partnerships between Oxford and individuals and institutions in India. The initiative is also a hub to coordinate India-related activities across Oxford, where we are a contact point for potential external partners. As a reminder, we are live streaming and the video will subsequently be available on our website. Welcome to all our viewers.
I would like to begin by thanking the India-Oxford Initiative of Oxford University for this invitation to speak about my recently published book. I am in this talk summarizing my book, Voices of Dissent. I wrote it a year ago and based it on a couple of lectures that I have given in the previous year. At the start of the book, I try and define what I mean by dissent. The earlier part of the book then discusses 2 broad examples of some dissenting ideas and activities as they were expressed in the Indian past. In the latter part of the book, I refer to a couple of examples that suggest a link between the comprehension of dissent in past times with some of the ways in which it has been expressed in our own times. My interest in the subject is not recent, nor was it roused primarily by increasing attempts to disallow dissenting opinion in many parts of the world today, including my own society. But I have been writing on the concept of dissent off and on for the last half century, and I see dissent as central to social and cultural change in many societies, as in Indian society. And this is a centrality which is generally ignored, but of course has pertinence for the present as well. Even the evolving of what we call civilization is a process that has required dissent and consent in selecting what is acceptable and what is to be rejected. We pay little attention to these debates, assuming that the process was constantly consensual. My other purpose in attempting this study is to show the continuity of the presence of dissent in various forms through the centuries. Some characteristic forms can be recognized from the Indian national movement for independence and our subsequent efforts to establish a democratic society. Let me begin, therefore, by attempting to define what I mean by dissent. It stems from a difference of opinion or a disagreement, but is not arbitrary. It may begin with a minor disagreement, but is recognized as dissent when it refers to a specific issue of some substance that introduces ideas of change in thought and practice. Dissent, therefore, has to be directed to a matter of importance. It can be a form of protest, although protest is generally more organized. Therefore, it is perhaps better to say that dissent can change into or become a form of protest. And a distinguishing feature is that dissent is non-violent. Dissent tends to be more vocal in what we call complex societies, that is, societies that bring together a variety of communities following diverse occupations, social rules, and belief systems. The process of formulating the requirements of civilization meant selecting ideas and forms of expression, discarding some and furthering others. The interplay of conformity and dissent cannot be ignored. Dissent encourages the questioning of the world in which we live, and in this process, alternatives are formulated. Any advance in knowledge requires questioning existing knowledge. Existing explanations sometimes give way to newer and better ones. Otherwise, there is stagnation. Dissent lies at the root of philosophical discourse, as is stated more than once in, for example, Indian philosophical discussion. For instance, it is said that when making a statement of some consequence, the first step is to state clearly and at length the views of the opponent disagreeing with the proposed argument, the Purva Paksha, as he is referred to. The second step is the refutation by the proponent, the Pratipaksh, of the statement of the opponent. And finally, there is a debate or dialogue on the two views in the hope for a solution, a siddhanta. This seemingly dialectical method is common to most schools of philosophy. It appears to have been practiced in the debates that are referred to as taking place in the royal courts. For instance, the debate between the Shaiva and the Buddhists at the court of Harshavardhana of Kanauj in the 7th century AD. What this procedure recognizes is the centrality of dissent and the importance of dialogue in the search for a solution when dissent is registered. And these are two facets which are fundamentally important, the centrality of dissent and the importance of dialogue. My examples of dissent are from the religions of pre-modern India. This is not because I think that religion is the primary area where dissent is registered, but because dissent can be seen with greater clarity in every religion. Secondly, my concern is not with dissent in theology, but in some of the social theories that religions construct and that may attract a following. The explanations were diverse, and in modern times, however, attempts were made to bring all religious movements in India, other than the Abrahamic, under a single umbrella. They were seen as multiple manifestations of the same religious doctrine with few dissenting opinions. This is least helpful in understanding them, as not all conform and many disagree. In the study of Indian religion, it is often the diverse sects that give a direction to religion rather than any monolithic unities that we ascribe to them. Religious institutions reflect social values and activity, and apart from monasteries and nunneries that are distinct from society, there are institutions such as places of worship or schools of learning that contribute substantially to the actions and ethics of a society. The intersection of religious ideas and social activities may lead to dissenting opinions, as in fact they often do, and the breaking away of a group then gives rise to a sect. The multiple sects that sprout around every religion can be expressions of deviance or dissent or modifications of existing forms. And a sect finds its place somewhere along this spectrum. This is a very different pattern from contending with a single unified monolithic religion. Let me illustrate then what I am saying with a couple of examples where dissent has been crucial to the form taken by ensuing religions. An early articulation of this was in what began as a parallel movement, but dissented significantly from established religion. Eventually, it too faced its own orthodoxy. Some existing elements were internalized and others rejected in order to create a different kind of religion. Vedic Brahmanism was the dominant religious presence in the earlier part of the first millennium BC. The belief in multiple gods was represented in abstract, worshipped through elaborate sacrificial rituals that consumed much of the wealth that was produced. And its ethics drew on the belief that the reincarnation of the individual soul was determined by actions in the present life. This view met with dissent from what have been broadly termed the Shramana religions. Buddhists in the main, but often including Jains, Ajivakas, and the Charvaka or Lokayata. They denied the existence of deities. Consequently, Vedic texts could not be taken as revealed and therefore sacred. Forms and locations of worship were not the same, And the definition of reincarnation and possible liberation from it also differed. This dissent was only broadly uniform even among the Shamanas, as there were degrees of disagreement among them as well. References to the Brahman-Shramana confrontation are explicit in the edicts, for example, of the Mauryan king Ashoka, who pleaded for greater tolerance and harmony among them. The period, in fact, from the Mauryas to the Guptas is one in which the competition is apparent. It is only in the post-Gupta period that Brahmanism emerges triumphant. Brahmanical writing refers to these dissenters as Nastika, non-believers. The term continued to be used for them in Sanskrit texts even as late as the 16th century AD. The hostility between Brahmins and Shramanas was known, and that between the Shaivas and the Shramanas was much more frequent. The term Nastika was not confined to the Shramanas. It included all non-believers, and thus, in one text, in the medieval period, the list of the non-believers also included the Turushkas, literally Turks, but used more widely for those of Central Asian origin. This brings to mind, of course, the other familiar term for non-believers that came to India at about the same time, namely kafir. The Turushka was actually a believer in deity, but in the wrong deity, because he believed in the Islamic Allah. However, he was excluded because he did not believe in any of the Brahmanical gods. Buddhism had its own dissenters. A significant dichotomy separated Hinayana and Mahayana sects, interpreting the teachings of the Buddha. Each had multiple differentiated sects, evolving variously. This was also noticeable when Buddhist missionary activity came to the fore in Central Asia and China during the first millennium AD. In these areas, it met with conditions different from what it had known in the subcontinent, and with different variants. This led to questions, the answers to which could result in the founding of a new sect, and the degree of demarcation from the existing religious order was variable. The success of a religion depends on its relationship with society, and particularly with those in authority. It needs to have a popular following, and this the Shramana religions had. Vedic Brahmanism was a religion exclusive to the upper castes, who as patrons provided the patronage and the wherewithal for the rituals. Patronage is essential to establishing the social base of a religion. Vedic Brahmanism had a prestigious, wealthy, but small patronage. The popular religions that grew out of these currents of change and took form was what are now being called Puranic Hinduism, forms of Puranic Hinduism. Puranic Hinduism did not formally dissent from Vedic Brahmanism, but in effect had recognizable differences. It incorporated Vaishnava, Shaiva, and Shakta worship, and under these labels also mopped up what was useful from local cults. The focus was on deity. One among the many had prominence, and these deities had either been absent or marginal in Vedic worship. Each of the major deities of Puranic Hinduism were maintained by distinctive sects with distinctive texts, such as, for example, the Purans. Variations within the sects could have a large range. Origins, myths, and rituals were recorded, irrespective of whether deities were old or recent. Institutions were parallel to, but different from those of the Shramanas. Temples replaced chaityas, sometimes literally, and often became places of pilgrimage, thereby attracting commercial activities. Icons of the deities were introduced with elaborate rituals, some invented afresh. And the monastery was as yet alien to Brahmanism, although something echoing it, like the mutt, became a focus of propagation. The renouncer, who became a monk or a nun, had limited links with society, but was not to be confused with the ascetic, the self-exiled person living in complete isolation. Renunciation was a path to nirvana, but broadly speaking, it involved dissent from much of Brahmanical teaching. It was an opting out of social obligations and adopting an alternative lifestyle with a focus on self-liberation. However, it was not self-isolation, since contact with society had to continue. The monk had to collect his food as alms from people in the vicinity and be concerned about their well-being. This was required by Shramana teaching. Violence of any kind was disallowed. And it can be seen as a reciprocal relationship, new and different from what had existed earlier. The ideal, the symbol, the practice of renunciation was implicit in the image of what came to be called the holy man, the man who meditates, heals, performs miracles, and is helpful in misfortune. He is not the priest. As often happens, this was an icon that could be used effectively, but could also be abused in giving direction to a community. The later incoming religions brought new ideas. These could either create dissent or be amalgamated into new practice and beliefs. The mixing and the merging of new religious forms takes shape even more clearly with the seeping in of Islam. The Arabs, we say, came through invasion in Sindh in the 8th century AD. But their more effective entry was as migrant traders, all down the west coast of India, from Gujarat to Kerala. The religious mix that emerged took the form of new socio-religious sects, dissenting from both Puranic Hinduism and Islam. Sects such as the Bohras, Khojas, Mapilas, Nawaites, and such like. The entry of Turks, Afghans, and Mughals into northwestern India followed from the familiarity that Central Asia had had with northern India through the earlier Silk Route. The Central Asian presence was intensified when it came through invasion, but its impact was felt when they actually settled as migrants. And the new religion that came largely through various Sufi sects with their diverse ideas and practices, some dissenting from the existing religions in India, but some actually borrowing from the existing religions. This explains why the proponents of Krishna Bhakti, for example, devotion to the deity of Krishna, the incarnation of Vishnu, were not only devotees such as Vallabhacharya and Surdas, but also well-placed Muslims. Sayyid Ibrahim, or Ras Khan, as he is better known, and Abdul Rahim Khane Khanan were among those who have composed the most exquisite dohas, couplets in Hindi in praise of the love of Krishna and Radha. The verses are still sung as bandishes in Hindustani classical music. These were among the people that were discredited as dissenters by those claiming to speak for the established religions, by the Qazis, the Mullahs, and the Maulavis, as well as by the Pandits and the Brahmins. Bhakti as a religious form had multiple nuclei all over the subcontinent, with prayers and verses composed in the local language. In modern times, these multiple sects have been treated as part of one unified monolithic religious movement. They were actually diverse and responded to specific local religious requirements. They were not defining a subcontinental religion. This was a turn endorsing regional cultures. The context of the region needs more attention. Did they respond at the regional level rather than at a subcontinental level? The diversity and the dissent becomes more apparent. Each bhakti sant, and I don't like the term saint, I prefer the original term sant. Each bhakti sant worshipped one deity of choice in his or her own way, with or without rituals, and through songs and narratives in the local language. There was, therefore, a tremendous diversity geared to the local region, although there were a few broad similarities. Deities differed, or the same one was worshipped in different ways. Why was there a difference? The localization is evident from there being little or no mention of other bhakts from distant places. Kabir, for example, is unaware of the Alvars from Tamil Nadu. Mira does not know about Andal. For some, the worship of the deity was paramount, and for others, it was the social message of equality implicit in their devotion, which was paramount. Ravidasa, for instance, describes his utopia as the imagined city of Beghampura, the city where there is no sorrow, Begham, because there is the social equality of all. At the same time, there was dialogue between Sufi and Bhakti sects, an example of which was the very interesting exchange, very effective exchange between Sufi sects and Nath yogis resident in the Punjab. We today don't hesitate to identify the Sufi as Muslim and the Nath yogi as Hindu. But in fact, both groups who exchanged ideas and practices from each other were dissenters from the established religions, and again were excluded by the Maulavis and the Brahmins. Dissent, it seems, was always present. The Purans continue to treat the Nastikas and the Shamanas, the red-robed monks, with hostility. The Bhakti tradition incorporates dissent in different measures. The interesting question is, when and how, in each instance, did orthodoxy come to accept or to reject the teaching of the different Bhakti sants? In the acceptance, of course, there was then the endorsement by the orthodoxy, such as the Brahmins. But this is a later development and very interesting. In the second millennium AD, manifestations of bhakti surfaced in different regions. As long as patronage was available for maintaining temples, mutts, agraharams, mosques, madrasas, dissent did not impinge on the patrimony of the orthodox sects. But when patronage began to shift to the bhakti and Sufi teachers, as in the 16th century, then presumably both the Brahmins and the mullahs would have been anxious about their own future and may well have been willing to make some changes in their own teaching. Patronage created an almost predictable dichotomy. Wealthy patrons, royalty, landowners, traders, and such like, provided the wherewithal for building the institutions for sects, largely of the Orthodox. But when the following of what might be called the more liberated sects increased, then their popularity would have made them politically attractive. This brought in further patronage. The dargahs and khanqahs of the Sufis and bhakti cult centers such as Pandharpur and Vrindavan flourished. We have to recognize that dissent was always present as an undercurrent in the ideas and movements associated with many aspects of life. Its visibility is more apparent in the religion of the elite in our times. This religion was malleable and underwent change if so required. This happened in the reformulation of Indian religion in colonial times. But the presence of dissent nevertheless remained, although it was not given sufficient recognition. So let me turn to modern times. What have been called socio-religious reform movements of the 19th century, Brahmo Samaj, Arya Samaj, Pratha Samaj, and such like, were inevitably imprinted with some colonial ideas. They questioned Brahman orthodoxy, but with the intention of suggesting reform rather than any heterodox replacement. The Arya Samaj, for instance, reconstructed Vedic society as a utopia and propagated returning to those values and practices. Calls to return to tradition are sometimes based on a tradition that was virtually invented and in accordance with the ideological and social needs of the present. Among these calls to tradition, among these calls in present times, was the call to nationalism, envisioning a past utopia and a golden age. Some advocated a new utopia of a secular democratic state, which was largely the motivation of secular nationalism. Whereas others proposed a state identified with the majority religion as a significant ingredient. Democratic nationalism was both a protest against colonial rule and the articulation of dissent. And the degree of dissent was in accordance with its becoming a manifestation of social protest. The protest, incorporating degrees of dissent, attracted a large number of people who became supporters of secular nationalism. This nationalism was distinct from the nascent but growing religious nationalisms, the Muslim and the Hindu. These had a different agenda and teleology. Their intention was to establish religious majoritarian states, the Islamic one as Pakistan, and the possibly imminent Hindu Rashtra. These two religious nationalisms took their cue from the colonial understanding of Indian history and a disinterest in confronting colonial power. The more secular national movement, envisaging a more democratic nation state, took forward some of the ideas of dissent as had been formulated in earlier times. This was in addition to the very new ideas that nationalism introduced. This mutation, as it were, of old ideas was more in keeping with the requirements of groups protesting against colonial rule. A few earlier forms of dissent surfaced again, and among them were the two that were adopted by Gandhi. One was dharna, and the other was what was called satyagraha. How conscious he was of adopting earlier forms is something that would require investigating. Mine is just a hint. What I am arguing is that one among the many reasons for the success of both these forms of protest in the 20th century was that the Indian public was familiar with these forms as a kind of tradition of dissent. Dharna was known and practiced in some of the smaller kingdoms, especially in parts of Western India. Dissatisfied subjects would express their disagreement with the ruler through a dharna. This involved convincing the bard, the charan or the bhat, that the dissatisfaction was justified. If convinced, the bard would then place himself at the threshold of the palace and declare that he would a fast unto death until the ruler reconsidered his decision. Why was the bard so important? He and his community maintained the genealogy of the ruling family. This provided evidence of their claims to high status. The genealogy was often the skeleton of the royal narrative. The bard maintained his independence by not becoming an officer of the state. In other words, he was the independent legitimizer of power. The bard was no ordinary person, even if of low caste. He was also a royal emissary, and as such, his person is inviolable, and this is underlined. Should the hunger strike result in his death, it would be taken as a huge stigma on the ruler, justifying his removal. The resort to such a fast was a known and accepted political weapon in these kingdoms. Where Gandhi resorts to fasts to make a political demand, either from the colonial power or from competing nationalisms, he is projected as an independent person with the stature of a Mahatma, literally the great soul, in effect, the holy man again. He takes it upon himself to speak for the people of India in supporting their demand for freedom or to live in harmony, else he will lose his life. He had the stature to take this position, and this was recognized both by the Indian public and by the colonial power. Gandhi's major formulation of a method of dissent, which became associated with him, was, however, what he called satyagraha, literally holding the truth. This is also described as passive resistance. The creation of this form of dissent drew partly, and perhaps subconsciously, from a tradition of dissent that prevailed in the many cultures of India, and which I have referred to earlier. Satyagraha was a form of dissent that used older practices in a modern situation. It can be called dissent since it has the required characteristics. These were familiar to the Indian public from the continuing presence of the renouncers, the bhakti sants, and other categories of what may be called loosely opters out. All of these claimed the right to deny consent if they so wished. These characteristics are evident. Dissent is not just disagreement. Its intention has an objective. The objective in South Africa was not identical with the later one in India. Nevertheless, dissent is directed towards political and social change, ensuring the well-being of people. This makes it reminiscent of the aims of the Shramanas and the Bhakti Sants. It does not merely advocate a return to a vague golden age of largely fantasy. It has specific objectives. Non-violence is a marked component, hence its description as passive resistance and civil disobedience. It endorses a dialogue between opposite opinions in order to arrive at a solution reminiscent of the method suggested in early times for solving opposing arguments. It is inclusive of all the citizens of a nation, men and women, low caste, high caste, of all religions. It is specifically not majoritarianism. And implicit in its thinking is the need for a democratic foundation for a society. There are no barriers or objections to anyone joining. It is irrespective of religion, of caste, of status, whether high or low. It is in fact required that women also participate in the movement. The presence of women is particularly striking, as indeed it was in the earlier movements of dissent. It was, after all, the Shramanas that permitted women to take up renunciation as nuns, admittedly after some debate and persuasion. Women sons, such as Andal and Meera, were accepted as teachers. It is often forgotten that the confined condition of women, as advocated in the Dharmashastra texts, is not what was advocated in all texts and practices in past times. Some were different, even if the difference was one of degree. The national movement did not necessarily treat all women as liberated citizens. Nevertheless, there were some activities in which it was thought that women should be more active and effective, such as picketing liquor shops and objecting to mill-made cloth. It was the realization that if dissent is to be effective, it must be the voice of both men and women. The Salt Satyagraha called for the participation of women. It would be worth knowing in greater detail how such events were given form, who participated, and why, to ascertain the reaction of the public to the meaning of such activities. After 1947, passive resistance on any scale and in an obvious way has not been used when opposing the laws of government. Sporadic expressions of dissent these days can be met by arrests. But what comes to mind are the two recent incidents of Shaheen Bagh and the farmers' protest in the vicinity of Delhi. Shaheen Bagh and other protests linked to it in other cities had a larger component of women and of students expressing their opposition to the new law, the Citizen Amendment Act of the government, debarring some categories of people from citizenship. The farmers' protest was also a non-violent protest against newly formulated laws on agricultural produce, with protesters demanding dialogue. The demand for dialogue was crucial. It has remained non-violent despite the attempt of intruders to break the protest with violence. In both these cases, the withdrawal of the law was at issue and was a non-violent demand. It was also tied to the question, crucial to democratic decisions, as to how these laws were being received by those most closely affected by them. Dissenting views today have a new dimension. We are no longer a colony. We are aspiring to function as a secular democracy. In this context, the protests are a comment on the question that some have raised in discussion in very recent times. Is elected representation sufficient for expressing the wishes of the people? Should there be additional ways of assessing the latter? Such questions are pertinent in the context of how democracy should function now and in the future. One may ask as to what Gandhi would have said to recent forms of passive resistance. A distinction between the colonial situation and that in an independent nation state should be evident when it comes to justifying dissent. The passive resistance of Gandhi was a form of dissent. Should the legitimacy of such forms of dissent in an independent democratic nation state be disallowed? In many parts of the world today, dissent has come to be treated as anti-national. Yet democracy, and more so liberal secular democracy, endorses the role of dissent as necessary to the debate before decisions are taken. And this, as I have quoted earlier, is a maxim as old as the hills: the views of the opponent, then the views of the proponent, and the dialogue between the two. And this has been practiced since early times in most societies. Let me conclude with a few thoughts. The generation that expressed dissent in anti-colonial movements is fast passing away. For those that follow, there has to be an awareness of the historical centrality of dissent. It was historically important. That has to be registered. This was essential to the fashioning of various societies in past times, as I've tried to show, as indeed also in the making of democratic forms and norms in our times. It is useful, therefore, to recognize the inevitability of dissent in the events that shaped history and are now shaping the present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Romila, for that wonderful lecture, so necessary to understand not only our past, but our present and indeed even our future. I found it extraordinarily enlightening and important what you said about the continuity of traditions of dissent even though, of course, their contexts change very greatly in the lengthy period of time you have taken us through. I have a couple of questions of my own, but before I ask them, I want to urge our viewers to write their questions in the Q&A box, Q&A function of Zoom, and I will come to them shortly. So when you were speaking, Romila, I was thinking of the way in which a kind of conventional idea of dissent, especially intellectual dissent, is represented in Western or European history, and starting with the ancient Greeks. And it often has to do with a tension between the thinker or the philosopher on the one hand, and the city, the polity, and religion on the other, leading eventually to the separation of philosophy as a distinctive site of free thought. But it seems to me that what you've been talking about in the Indian tradition, if we can even use that term, is the presence of dissent, intellectual or otherwise, within the city and within religion itself, that it's not being separated out completely from those two sides of human flourishing, so that even the figure of the renunciant, as you pointed out, continues to be related to religious belief and practice and to politics. I wonder if, I don't know if that is true or not, but what I wanted to ask is, I wonder if in modern times, we might be seeing the final separation of the critical or the dissenting function from religion, that it is no longer necessarily to be found within, that dissent is not necessarily expressed any longer, or at least in a significant way in religious terms, that its very secularization seems to have allowed religious beliefs and practices to become part of a kind of, I don't know, a realm of the unthought or the unthinking, or at least the non-dissenting. I don't know if you think there is any merit in this suggestion. It is not even an argument of mine, but it occurred to me when I was hearing you speak about the fate of dissent, because it begins squarely within the realm of what you might call religion or belief, and it ends in these great protests, which include, of course, many believers and religious people, but necessarily protests that occur outside the realm of religion and belief. Or am I mistaken? I might well be mistaken.
Mm-hmm. Let me clarify that I was not trying to argue that religion is the only area of life in which you have dissenting groups. I picked it up simply because it's so clear. I mean, dissent in philosophy is there, has to be, because in all forms of knowledge, knowledge cannot advance unless you question what is already there and you disagree and you say, no, I have a better explanation. Whether it's mathematics or it's astronomy or philosophy or medicine or whatever it may be. So that is not something that I was concerned with, since that is conceded that it's there. Dissent in one's life can take various forms. I mean, I didn't go into the question, for example, what would be very interesting for a historian with more energy than I have, to do something on social rules. I mean, to what extent were the Dharma Shastras actually put into practice? At what levels, by whom, what were the social rules? Were they dissenting ideas? What were the dissenting ideas? Did these dissenting ideas influence the structure of society in some way? We don't study that as historians, or at least enough of us don't. And I think that that is extremely important. So similarly, even in things in organizing political opinion, even in pre-modern times, what was the role of dissent? If one is taking dharna into consideration, then it did have a role. It had a very important role. And then one goes into the whole question of why did it have this important role and why was it expressed in this particular way? So I think, yes, I was simply picking on religion because it's the easiest example. It's so obvious. Now, I think the fundamental point that I was trying to make was that perhaps it is more obvious and clear in the religions of maybe India and China. I don't know very much about China, but it was certainly, which are very different from the experience of Abrahamic religions, where there is dissent, but it is expressed in a different way. And what I was trying to argue was that if we concede that there is an importance to dissent and start looking for it, then we start looking for it in every aspect of life, not just religion. One could argue, I suppose, in a way that the 1960s in America and Europe and the hippie movement was in some ways a dissent. It was in some ways a religious dissent in those terms. Do we concede that? And do we have histories, for example, of how dissenting opinion changed the formulation of the different aspects of Christianity in Europe? This would be the equivalent of what I'm asking for with Indian religions. What the issue, of course, becomes complicated in India because religious nationalism, which is politicizing religion of whatever kind, we don't have to go into any one particular one. The politicization of religion then, what is that going to do to dissent? You have the politicization of religion in the creation of Pakistan. You have it in the Hindu Rashtra. You have it in Khalistan. Now, this is a new thing. Religion is facing a new phenomenon, which it has never faced before. It's being asked to defend, identify, in fact, nationalism. Does it do so? If it does so, is it dissenting from religion or is it not? And so I think that these are fundamental questions that have to be asked, that it's not just religious nationalism, but to what extent can you then refer to religious nationalism as being the same as religion? I mean, the issue that is often raised by people today is Hindutva, Hinduism. This is an important issue. I mean, you're talking about the use of religion in a particular way when you're talking about Hindutva, and you're talking about religion in a different way. And I think that this is the question that's going to face us if we continue to concede the centrality of religious nationalism.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. We have many questions I will come to now, but just to reemphasize your point, the paradoxical situation we are in which the kinds of politics and verbosity of those who claim the name of religion can actually be understood as actually belonging to some other framework altogether, such as nationalism.
Yeah.
And forms of dissent which do not ostentatiously take the name of religion, nevertheless seem to derive more clearly from the kind of lineages that you have been describing to us today as religious. whether or not they claim that name for themselves. Let me turn to the questions. There are many. Let me begin with Devika, who writes, I am sorry I did not thank you for an absolutely brilliant lecture. You mentioned to qualify as dissent, there needs to be an assigned importance to the subject / structure / idea being challenged. The question I had was, how does one adjudge this importance? So therefore, what is important enough, and how do we as academics or even citizens identify and assign this importance? I suppose she's referring to what gets to achieve the status of dissent and what doesn't.
I think that's a two-way process. First of all, the people who are actually dissenting have to be quite convinced that it's terribly important. There's to be no weakness on that score. Otherwise, your dissent gets dissipated. Secondly, what is the reaction of the people you're appealing to? Every dissenting group has an audience. It may be very small, it may be very large. But if you're dissenting about something that has a large audience, you have to consider all the time, what is your audience having to say about it? Is it with you? And in what way is it with you? So it's a kind of coming and going between A, who says, I am dissenting because I disagree with X, Y, and Z, and the public that says, yes, I agree with you, or I don't agree with you. And it's the relationship between the dissenter and the public, which I think is absolutely crucial.
Here is a question, interesting question from Shrikant Bud. What historic relationship do you see between technical education and dissent in India? Would you say that the rise and prominence of STEM fields and related professions coincides with the decline of dissent in modern India? Sorry,
what is STEM field?
The sort of scientific and technical education.
I see. Oh, okay, yes. Well, you know, I'm sorry, I'm the wrong person to answer this because I really don't have enough contact with people working in science. I wish I did. I mean, I would love to go back once again to the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore and speak to people there because I would like to. My feeling is that for many people, for most people, there is a lack of, and let me preface this by saying this is my historian's prejudice. I believe very firmly that every discipline has a method. Why do we study something from a particular point of view? Why are we doing science from a particular point of view? Now that method of why we are doing science is not sufficiently, the scientists are not sufficiently aware of the discussion on this. I mean, I'm amazed at the number of Indian scientists I come across ordinarily who, when I mention Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, there is complete blank. And yet, you know, these texts like that are fundamental texts for scientists to explain why are they doing science? What is science all about? So what has happened, unfortunately, is that science in India is fast becoming a technology. This is how you do things, and this is how you do things better and better and better. And in a sense, unfortunately, the present moment brings this back in a big way. You have a pandemic, people are dying. And what is happening? There isn't a concern, there isn't a humane concern for why are people dying, what should we be doing, etc. It's all a question of how can we grab oxygen, how can we grab vaccines. People are black marketing all of this. Now, you know, there's something wrong with a society that is indulging in the black marketing of crucial things that are required, where people are dying at the rate at which they're dying. Something's gone wrong somewhere. You know, you might say that educated people have to do a study of ethics, but whatever it may be, it is perfectly true that, you know, scientists in India, in a sense, don't get the better grasp. Most scientists, there are, of course, some very exceptional people, they don't get a grasp of what the discipline is about. And this is not just with scientists. I would say that this is also very strong with other people too. I mean, the number of young historians I come across who really don't understand historiography or what it really means to be a historian. Why are we studying history? And therefore, you know, somebody comes along and says, oh yes, there were airplanes in the Ramayana. You believe it, because you haven't understood the fundamentals of your discipline, which is look for the evidence, look for reliable evidence. If you've got reliable evidence, then make a statement, otherwise keep shut. But in the case of science, I think there is a very serious lack of not just the humanities, but there is a very serious lack altogether in our educational system of trying to understand what are the ethics of being a human society. You have to have fundamental ethics. Otherwise, you know, you go the way in which some horrible nightmarish societies have gone. Mm-hmm. And that is missing, whether it's science. So yes, there is today, it's technology which has replaced science. And I think it's up to scientists to make an issue of this and insist that the principles of scientific thinking should come back into what we call technological thinking today. They are not different, they are essential. You cannot have improvements in technology unless you think scientifically, but you cannot destroy that scientific thinking by giving emphasis to technology.
Yes, in a way that takes us back to the question of morality and so religion as well, yeah. How those should influence other spheres of life. I have a very interesting question here from Abhishek Matta. The lecture beautifully delineated the continuity in traditions of dissent. I am curious to know if Professor Thapar could comment on or shed some light on the continuity in the traditions of counter-dissent, and also if this history of counter-dissent is necessarily tied to the formation of the nation state.
Yes, I think once we begin to recognize the existence of dissent in whatever we're studying, then the obvious question is, was there a counter-dissent? Yes, there was a counter-dissent. In fact, I was hinting at that somewhat when I said that, you know, there were these groups of people whom we called Hindus and Muslims who were in fact disapproved of by the orthodoxy of both. Now, this is a kind of counter-dissent. When the orthodoxy comes out and says, no, these people are absolutely misguided and all the rest of it. To use the terminology of today that, you know, when we historians are attacked for the kind of history we write, yes. We are uniformly referred to as Marxists. These are all Marxists, and therefore they're writing this kind of history, which is not really the real history, etc., etc., etc. Now, the thing is that, you know, obviously there is counter-dissent, but finding the counter-dissent will only come when we know what the dissent is. And therefore my plea is very much that we should look at culture, civilization, and our present existence in terms of recognizing both consent and dissent.
Yeah, there are a number of questions which have to do with contemporary India and Hindutva. But let me take one which came early on, which deals with Brahminical culture. This is from Madhu Chebrol. The structural basis of the conception of dharma as an evolving process needs to be understood in order to properly place in context the ever-changing tradition of Brahminical ideals deeply embedded within scholarly debate, discussion, and philosophical musing. It is only in light of historical context that such issues can be appreciated to their fullest extent, placing them in the clear context of the times in which they were written, understanding if the rules themselves were as strict in conception and whether they were understood to be rigid rules. How far can this be useful to contend with the monolithic cultural space of India?
I think actually the term dharma has a lot of scope for further research, because there is a tendency to try and find a uniform definition for dharma. And clearly, it's not going to be found, because concepts like that do not have uniform definitions. The definitions change within traditions of thinking. The dharma of philosophers is very different from the dharma of practicing priests, is very different from the dharma of the Dharma Shastras. Consequently, I think that really, yes, in a sense, we have to re-examine these concepts and see to what extent there is a debate going on at that time in terms of how to look at these concepts. The dharma of the Brahmins is very different from the dharma of the Buddhists, and there is a debate going on. We tend to put them all together under one label and, combine various definitions and make a kind of hodgepodge out of it. But in fact, they're very distinctive differences. And these differences are necessary, not because some of us are trying to sort of talk about there being dissent. It's not as if we're trying to underline dissent as a negative feature of culture or anything, but simply seeing what is the dynamic quality of the discussions that went on in ancient times, and see, in fact, how far they continued, how they changed, and why they changed. I mean, the concept of dharma has changed repeatedly through the centuries. So how did they change? And yes, this does have relevance to the fact that if you believe in there being a single unified monolithic religion, and you pick up one definition of dharma and say, this is it, you're first of all defying history, about which I feel very strongly, but at the same time, you're defying your own enterprise, because the whole enterprise of this kind of discussion is that you define it in terms of its context, and context inevitably changes. I mean, the first thing that a historian learns is that every context changes, and you have to be ready to recognize that change. Therefore, I think it's not just that one is opposing the idea of a monolithic unified religion. One is looking at how did our societies understand religion. This is really the plea that historians like myself are making, that we should get away from seeing religion as something frozen, that it happened at a particular point in time, these were the rules and regulations, and it got frozen. And even the Abrahamic religions, we know, did not get frozen. They changed like mad over the centuries and are still changing, like every good religion goes on changing. But I think that we have to understand that the underlying functioning, the underlying way of behaving as a religion is different from culture to culture.
I mean, in a way, I wonder whether, going back to what you said very early on in your lecture, that the making of a single tradition, even if the pretense that there exists a single tradition, even if it includes within itself all manner of diversity, ends up domesticating dissent, so that dissent simply becomes a kind of pretty virtue one can show off. But also, I suppose you can see how this way of thinking works in the political realm in our own day,
Yes.
where parliamentary opposition is considered to be the sole legitimate form of expressing disagreement, and nothing else is to be allowed. Whereas, as you point out, whether it is dharna or satyagraha, hartal, all of these forms of disagreement and dissent have been crucial to Indian society. And I wonder whether, in a way, the achievement of India's independence, the long-awaited triumphal achievement amidst tragedy of India's independence, ended up to some degree delegitimizing the very social space in which the freedom movement had put on display these these traditions of dissent with very long histories, Gandhian nonviolence clearly being crucial to them, so that the idea of nonviolence remains, but it seems to have been redefined. It's no longer what you suggested was that you cannot have thought or thinking or debate with violence.
Yeah.
So it has become a purely instrumental thing, about
right.
the law.
And in a sense also, there's a certain lack of understanding of that essential character of nonviolence. It's become a slogan in many cases. I mean, there are, of course, very genuine people who know and understand it and use it in its essential sense. But for many, it's a slogan. And that is unfortunate. When something becomes a slogan, it's as good as dead.
So I've been told that we have gone over time already, and there are many, many more questions. And I will have to apologize for all those who have asked. A number of them, as I said, were about the contemporary period, in any case, which you have addressed. So I want to end, Romila, by thanking you for your generosity in speaking to us today, especially in the midst of a crisis of unimaginable proportions in Delhi and in India.
But that's very much part of one's life now.
Yes, and part of all our lives in various ways.
Yeah.
I want to close then by thanking you, of course, all those who have attended your lecture and asked questions, and the India Oxford Initiative, which has sponsored this lecture, the Asian Studies Center at St. Anthony's College, another sponsor, and the South Asian Studies Program at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies. These are the three sponsors of this lecture. So thank you very much again, Romila. Always a pleasure to see and hear from you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Faisal. And thanks to all the organizations.